entitled parents, my coworker blackmailed me using my son's kidney needs. #chunk1. The email notification pinged on my work computer at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, and I felt my stomach drop into my shoes. It was from Melissa Chen, my coworker in the adjacent cubicle, the one I'd been avoiding in the break room for the past 3 weeks. *, we need to talk. My office. Now. And don't tell anyone you're coming. *. My hand started shaking. I stared at the message for a solid 30 seconds, my eyes reading the same 12 words over and over like they might rearrange themselves into something less threatening. They didn't. I'd already sent my mom a quick text that I'd be late picking up Marcus from after-school care. She'd replied with a thumbs-up emoji, probably assuming I had a meeting with administration. If only it were that simple. Taking the stairs instead of the elevator, partly because I needed the moment to think, partly because I couldn't bear being trapped in a metal box, I climbed to the 3rd floor where Melissa's office sat tucked behind the finance department. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought my blouse might actually vibrate. Melissa was waiting for me in her chair, legs crossed, a cup of coffee sitting untouched on her desk. She had that look on her face, the one I'd come to recognize and dread. Satisfied. Predatory. "Close the door," she said without looking up at me. I did, and the soft click of the latch felt like a prison door slamming shut. "We're going to make a little arrangement," Melissa continued, finally meeting my eyes with a cold smile. "And you're going to agree to every single term, or I'm going to make sure everyone in this hospital knows that you've been using your son's medical condition for sympathy and special treatment at work." The words hit me like a physical blow. I gripped the back of the chair across from her, suddenly grateful for something solid to hold on to. "What are you talking about?" The words came out as barely a whisper. "Please." She laughed, a sharp, cutting sound that made my teeth ache. "I know all about Marcus. Type O negative, right? The kidney failure diagnosis from 14 months ago? The mounting medical bills? The fact that he's been on the transplant list for almost a year now?" She paused, letting each revelation settle like a stone in my chest. "I know everything." My mouth went dry. "How did you?" "That's not important. What's important is that you're going to start covering my shifts whenever I ask. You're going to help me with my administrative projects, no complaints. And when I need money, you're going to loan it to me." "Absolutely not," I said, finding my voice, though it was barely steady. You're accessing confidential medical records. That's a federal crime." "Maybe." She shrugged, utterly unbothered. "But who do you think anyone's going to believe? The struggling single mother who conveniently has a sick child? Or me?" She gestured around her corner office, nicer than mine, better view. "Besides, if you try to report me, I'll make sure everyone knows you've been milking sympathy for your kid. I'll tell them you're exaggerating his condition, trying to get special accommodations, using him to manipulate the staff. By the time I'm done, they'll think you're one of those parents who makes up illnesses for attention." "No one would believe that," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew I was lying. People believed what they wanted to believe. And a narrative about a desperate, possibly unstable single mother trying to game the system? That was a story that would spread like wildfire. She smiled wider, as if she could read the defeat washing over me. "I think you'll find that they would. It's amazing what people will accept when it comes from the right source. And I have time to make this very convincing." I sank into the chair across from her, my legs suddenly unable to support my weight. 8 years old. My Marcus was 8 years old with a kidney that was slowly killing him. 8 years of his life without ever really getting to be a kid, without running on the playground the way he wanted to, without school trips, without a normal existence that didn't revolve around dialysis and doctor's appointments and the constant, gnawing fear that kept me awake at night. "How long?" I heard myself ask. "How long what? How long are you going to do this?" She tilted her head, considering. "As long as I need to. Could be months. Could be longer. Depends on how cooperative you are." I thought about Marcus at home with my mother, probably doing his homework at the kitchen table, probably not complaining about how tired he felt, probably not mentioning the headaches or the nausea because he didn't want to worry me. He was so good at being brave. It broke my heart. "And if I refuse?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Then I go to HR tomorrow with a detailed account of how you've been using your son's medical crisis to get out of work, how you've been asking people to cover for you because of his condition, and we both know I can make that sound really bad. I'll say you told me he was faking it sometimes, that you just needed the time off to party or take a vacation. I'll be very convincing. Very sympathetic about it too. Really paint you as unstable." A chill ran through me. She thought this through. Every angle, every consequence. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment threat. This was calculated, methodical, evil. "I need to think about this," I said. "No, you don't." She pulled out her phone and showed me her screen. There was a folder labeled Marcus Medical Records. Dozens of files. Detailed information about my son's condition, his blood type, his prognosis, his dialysis schedule. "You have 5 seconds to agree, or I'm sending this folder to the director of nursing, and we'll see how long you keep your job." I looked at her beautiful, cold face, the face of someone who had decided she could simply take what she wanted from my life, and there was nothing I could do to stop her. "Okay," I whispered. "I agree." Her smile was absolutely radiant. "I knew you would." #chunk2. The next 2 weeks were a blur of exhaustion and desperation. I covered Melissa's Friday night shift, then her Saturday morning shift, then somehow ended up covering her entire Tuesday through Thursday rotation the following week. I told my mom I'd picked up extra hours for the overtime pay, which was technically true, except I wasn't actually getting paid for most of it. The shifts were supposed to be credited to Melissa's schedule, which meant I was essentially working for free while she sat at home doing God knows what. The money situation started almost immediately. I was at my desk on Wednesday morning when she appeared beside my cubicle, coffee in hand, looking like she didn't have a care in the world. "I need $200 by Friday," she said casually, as if she was asking to borrow a pen. "My car payment is due." "I don't have $200, I said, which was the truth. My checking account had maybe $60 in it after paying Marcus's latest specialist copay. "I can give you $50. She set her coffee down on my desk, deliberately, making sure to leave a ring on some paperwork I'd been organizing, and leaned down so her mouth was near my ear. 200. Or I'll send an email to your supervisor explaining how you've been neglecting your actual job responsibilities to handle personal matters. I have timestamps of you taking personal calls, leaving early for doctor's appointments, checking your phone constantly during work hours. Really paints a picture of someone who shouldn't be trusted with administrative duties. I felt my jaw clench. Where am I supposed to get $200? That's your problem. She straightened up, collected her coffee cup. Not mine. She walked away before I could respond, her heels clicking against the linoleum in a rhythm that felt like a countdown timer on my life. By Friday, I'd borrowed the money from my mom, who asked what I needed it for. I told her it was for a copay Marcus's nephrologist had billed me directly for. The lie came out smoothly, which somehow made it worse. I was already adapting to the deception, learning to manipulate the people who loved me to cover for Melissa's extortion. That was when things got darker. I was pulling files in the records room on Thursday afternoon, a task Melissa had added to my duties, naturally, when I found myself standing in front of the transplant compatibility database that we used for organ matching. It was restricted access, of course. I shouldn't have been able to view it, but I had legitimate reasons to be in the system for my administrative work, and the access protocols weren't as tight as they probably should have been. On impulse, I searched for Marcus's information. The compatibility list populated, and I felt something strange flutter in my chest. There were only 2 potential matches in our regional database, both deceased donors with no definite timeline. But there was a notation at the bottom of the screen, the kind of flag that only showed up under certain circumstances. It said, living donor inquiry pending. My heart started racing. Living donor inquiry? That meant someone, a doctor, a social worker, someone, had flagged a potential living donor match. That almost never happened spontaneously. Someone had to initiate it. I shouldn't have done it. I absolutely, 100% should not have done it. But I clicked the flag to see the details. The pending inquiry had come from our hospital's transplant coordinator 3 days ago. The living donor prospect was listed as, relationship to patient, none, referred by hospital staff. My stomach did a backflip. Someone at the hospital knew about Marcus's condition and had flagged a potential match. How was that possible? Melissa had made it clear she was keeping this information to herself for blackmail purposes. She wouldn't have. Unless someone else knew too. I closed the database immediately, my hands shaking. If there was another person who knew about Marcus's kidney failure, another person accessing his records, that was a second breach. A second threat. But also, potentially, a second option. I needed to find out who had submitted that inquiry. That evening, I picked Marcus up from after-school care and took him to my mom's house as usual. He was pale, moving slowly, complaining that his head hurt again. I packed him a snack, even though I knew he wouldn't eat much, and tried to focus on his homework with him while my brain spiraled through worst-case scenarios. By the time I got home to my apartment at 9 p.m., I'd made a decision. I was going to have to be smarter than Melissa. More calculated. More ruthless. I pulled out my personal laptop and opened a secure email account with a generic name. Then I started researching. I needed to find out who had access to Marcus's records, who had submitted that transplant inquiry, and most importantly, who the living donor prospect was. The person flagged in the system. It took me an hour of careful searching through the hospital's internal systems, using my legitimate admin access as a cover, before I found what I needed. The pending inquiry had been submitted by Dr. Patricia Moore, our hospital's transplant coordinator. But there was something else in the notes, donor prospect referred by staff member regarding potential match compatibility. Someone on staff had referred a donor. I checked the timestamp again. The inquiry was from 3 days ago, the same day Melissa had called me into her office and made her threats. Which meant this had been initiated before she'd started her blackmail scheme. Which meant she didn't know about it. The realization hit me like a lightning bolt. There was someone else at this hospital who cared enough about Marcus, or about preventing Melissa from getting away with what she was doing, to take action. And now I had a completely different problem. I needed to figure out who it was, how much they knew, and whether they could actually help me, or if they were about to become another complication in an already impossible situation. I closed my laptop and sat in the darkness of my apartment, the glow of my phone screen illuminating my exhausted face. One enemy was hard enough. But an unknown ally? That might be even more dangerous. #Chunk3. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about Dr. Patricia Moore. I'd seen her around the hospital plenty of times, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and an exhausted expression that suggested she'd seen too much of human nature's worst side. She worked on the 3rd floor in the transplant coordination office, which meant accessing her without raising questions would require careful planning. I decided to approach it like a puzzle. The donor inquiry had come from her, but someone on staff had referred the donor. That meant there was a chain of communication. If I could figure out who referred the prospect, I could potentially trace back to whoever knew about Marcus. And maybe, just maybe, figure out if this mysterious person was someone I could trust. The problem was, I had no legitimate reason to be asking questions about pending donor inquiries. My job was administrative record keeping, not transplant coordination. Any direct questions would flag attention, and the last thing I needed was more scrutiny on the hospital systems after Melissa's blackmail scheme had already violated every privacy protocol we had. I decided to take the indirect route. That afternoon, I called the transplant coordinator's office under the pretense of a billing issue. When Dr. Moore picked up, I kept my voice professional and slightly confused, not hard, given that I actually was confused. Hi, Dr. Moore? This is Sarah Chan from Medical Administration. I'm updating some of our database protocols, and I'm running into some discrepancies with donor inquiry logging. I was wondering if you had a few minutes to clarify the referral process for me? Like, when someone on staff refers a potential living donor, what's the documentation procedure? There was a pause. I could almost hear her thinking on the other end of the line. That's an unusual question, she said carefully. Most of the time, administrative doesn't get involved in donor referral processes. I know, I said, laughing nervously. New corporate mandate. They want better documentation trails across all departments. Probably some HIPAA thing I don't fully understand. But if you have a minute, I'd really appreciate the help. Another pause. Then, sure. Come up to my office. It'll be easier to explain in person. My heart started racing. I hadn't expected that to work. I made my way to the third floor 20 minutes later, after making sure Melissa was occupied in the staff meeting I'd watched her enter. When I knocked on Dr. Moore's office door, she was waiting, sitting behind a desk covered in files and a cold cup of coffee. She was smaller than I'd expected, and her eyes were sharper than her tired expression suggested. She studied me for a long moment before gesturing to the chair across from her. So, she said. Billing protocol issues. I couldn't tell if she believed me or not. I decided to trust my instincts. Actually, I said, closing the door behind me, I'm not sure how to ask this without looking completely inappropriate. Dr. Moore's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, maybe. Or understanding. Then be inappropriate, she said. I've earned it. I took a breath. 3 days ago, you flagged a pending living donor inquiry. The referral came from hospital staff. I need to know who referred the donor and why. The silence that followed was deafening. Dr. Moore set down her pen slowly and folded her hands on her desk. That information is confidential, she said, but her voice was gentle. I know, I said. I also know that someone accessed my son's medical records without authorization. And I know that information was used to blackmail me. I need to find out if the person who submitted that donor inquiry knows about the blackmail, or if they're just. I trailed off, realizing I didn't know how to finish that sentence. Dr. Moore leaned back in her chair. Your son is Marcus Chin. 8 years old. Stage 5 renal disease. He's been on the transplant waiting list for 14 months. My mouth went dry. How do you? Because someone came to me 3 days ago and asked me to run a compatibility check on a specific individual, she said. They didn't give me all the details, but they were very clear that it was urgent and sensitive. They mentioned that there might be complications. Family complications. Workplace complications. They wanted me to flag any matches immediately and keep the process as quiet as possible. Who? I whispered. I can't tell you that, Dr. Moore said. Patient confidentiality and donor confidentiality are both at stake. But I can tell you that there is a match. A living donor who is compatible with your son's blood type and tissue profile. And I can tell you that the person who referred them was someone who clearly cares about this situation resolving correctly. My hands were shaking. Can the match happen? Can my son get the transplant? That depends on several things, Dr. Moore said carefully. It depends on whether the potential donor is willing. It depends on their health status and their understanding of what they're agreeing to. And it depends, she said, looking directly at me, on whether there are any complications preventing them from coming forward. The implication hung in the air between us. Someone is keeping the donor away from my son, I said. That would be my guess, Dr. Moore agreed. I felt something crack open inside my chest, not quite hope, but the possibility of hope. Someone at this hospital cared enough to try to help. Someone had figured out that there was a match, and they were trying to bridge the gap. But they were also aware that something was preventing it from happening naturally. What do I do? I asked. Nothing, Dr. Moore said. Not directly. What you do is let this process continue. The donor inquiry is pending. As soon as I get confirmation that the individual is willing to proceed, we'll move forward with full testing and compatibility verification. Your job is to not interfere with that process. But Melissa, I started. I know about Melissa, Dr. Moore said quietly. I don't know all the details, but I know enough. And I know that if you go after her directly, you're going to complicate everything. So what you're going to do is act normal. You're going to keep your head down and let the legal and ethical processes do their work. While she continues to blackmail me? I couldn't keep the desperation out of my voice. While she runs out of rope, Dr. Moore said. Because I'm quite certain that the person who referred your son's potential donor is going to make sure this situation gets resolved. And when it does, everything else is going to come crashing down. She stood up, signaling the end of our conversation. Go back to work, Miss Chin. Act like nothing happened. And maybe pray that whoever is helping your son has the strength to follow through. I left her office in a state of confused relief and renewed terror. Someone was trying to help. But I still didn't know who, and I still didn't know if they could actually pull it off. All I knew was that Melissa had no idea what was coming. And neither did I. #chunk4. The next 48 hours were torture. I went back to work the following morning and did exactly what Dr. Moore had instructed, acted normal. But normal felt like a thin mask stretched over a scream. Every time Melissa walked past my desk, every time she smiled that cruel, knowing smile, I had to remind myself that she had no idea someone was working against her. That there was a match. That my son might have a future. I also had to remind myself that the mask could slip at any moment. Marcus was having a bad day when I picked him up from school. His energy was low, his skin a shade paler than usual. The dialysis was taking more out of him than ever, and his nephrologist had mentioned at our last appointment that we were running out of time. The waiting list could take years. We didn't have years. We might not even have months. Mom, can we get ice cream? He asked from the back seat, his voice small and hopeful. Sure, buddy, I said, even though the dialysis guidelines were supposed to restrict his sodium and potassium intake. I'd learned to bend those rules when his mood was this low. What were the guidelines worth if he was miserable? We sat in the car at the ice cream shop, and I watched him eat a chocolate cone with a spoon because the cold hurt his teeth if he bit into it. These small degradations of his childhood were the hardest parts. Not the hospital visits or the medications or the dietary restrictions, but the way his body was slowly stealing his ability to be a normal 8-year-old. Mom, he said, licking the back of the spoon. Will I have to do dialysis forever? My throat tightened. We'd had this conversation before, but I never got better at it. No, baby, I said. Remember what Dr. Peterson said? Once you get a new kidney, you won't need dialysis anymore. But when will I get it? He asked, not accusingly, just factually. 8-year-olds had a way of cutting through the bullshit and asking the questions that mattered. Soon, I said. I think very soon. I hoped I wasn't lying. Friday brought a development I hadn't anticipated. I was in the break room refilling my coffee when Melissa cornered me. She did it casually, leaning against the counter with her arms crossed, but there was nothing casual about the edge in her voice. So I heard something interesting today, she said. From someone in transplant coordination. My hand froze on the coffee pot. Apparently, there's been a lot of activity on your son's case. New inquiries. Pending donor matches. Quite the uptick from the usual waiting list pace. She smiled. Funny how that works out, isn't it? I forced myself to finish pouring the coffee. I don't know what you're talking about, I said carefully. Sure you do, Melissa said. Someone's been pulling strings. Someone's been asking questions about your kid's compatibility profile. And someone at the hospital is clearly trying very hard to make something happen. She tilted her head, studying me. Do you know who that someone is? No, I said honestly. Interesting. Melissa's smile widened. Because I'm going to find out. And when I do, I'm going to make sure they understand what happens when people interfere with my business. My blood went cold. Melissa, if you threaten anyone. Threaten? She laughed. I'm not threatening anyone. I'm just saying that if someone has decided to help you out, they should probably understand the consequences. For example, what if their little good deed becomes public knowledge? What if people start asking questions about why they cared so much? What if their own medical history, or their own family situations, become the subject of hospital gossip? She leaned in closer. What if I decided to tell your son's school that his mother has been lying about his condition to get sympathy donations? The coffee cup in my hand was shaking. I set it down before I dropped it. You're evil, I said quietly. I'm practical, Melissa corrected. And I'm protecting my interests. So I suggest you tell whoever is helping you to back off. Because if they don't, I'm going to make sure this situation becomes so public and so messy that nobody in this hospital will ever want to work with you again. And your son's case will be tangled up in investigation and scandal for years. She walked out of the break room, leaving me standing there with a full cup of coffee I was too nauseous to drink. By Sunday night, I was convinced everything was falling apart. I'd been in a state of paralysis since Friday. I couldn't tell Dr. Moore what Melissa had said without potentially triggering exactly the kind of situation she'd warned me to avoid. I couldn't confront Melissa without confirming that something was happening. And I couldn't do nothing, because Melissa was clearly going to escalate. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer. Ms. Chen? The voice was male, unfamiliar. My name is Daniel Reeves. I think we need to talk. My entire body went rigid. Who gave you this number? Someone who cares about your son, he said. Someone who asked me to do something I never thought I'd be asked to do. Ms. Chen, I'm compatible with your son's blood type. I'm a perfect match for a kidney transplant. How did you? I work at the hospital, he said quietly. And my girlfriend is Melissa. She told me about your son, and she did it to use the information as leverage. To hurt you. And I couldn't. He trailed off. I couldn't let that stand. So I reached out to transplant coordination and I told them I wanted to be evaluated as a potential living donor. I didn't tell them who I wanted to help. I just said I wanted to donate. My heart was thundering in my chest. You can't do this, I said. Melissa will. I know she will, Daniel said. That's why I'm calling you now. I'm calling to tell you that I'm doing this anyway. And I'm calling to give you fair warning that everything is about to explode. My girlfriend is going to figure out what I'm doing, and she's going to do exactly what she threatened to do to you. But by then, your son will be in testing, and she won't be able to stop the process. Why would you do this? I asked. You barely know us. Because, Daniel said simply, I know what it's like to have someone use you as a tool for power. And I'm not doing it anymore. Not for her. Not for anyone. Your son deserves a chance, and I can give him one. So that's what I'm going to do. The line went dead. I sat in the darkness of my bedroom, my phone still pressed to my ear, and felt the ground shift beneath everything I thought I understood about how this was going to go. Everything was about to go very, very wrong. #chunk 5. The next morning, I called in sick. I couldn't face the office, couldn't sit at my desk and pretend everything was normal while knowing that Daniel had already set events in motion that neither of us could control. My hands shook as I dialed the hospital's main line and requested to be transferred to Dr. Moore's office. Her secretary told me she was in rounds. I left a message marked urgent. By 9 in the morning, my phone rang. It was Dr. Moore. I heard from transplant coordination about an hour ago, she said without preamble. There's been a development. A donor has come forward, a living donor, voluntary evaluation. Perfect match for your son's blood type and tissue compatibility markers. Can you come in today? I know about the donor, I said. His name is Daniel Reeves. Silence on the other end. Then, how do you know that? He called me. Last night. He's my coworker's boyfriend. I heard Dr. Moore exhale slowly. Ms. Chen, if there's any coercion involved in this. There isn't, I said quickly. Not from me. Not toward him. He's doing this voluntarily, but his girlfriend doesn't know yet. His girlfriend is the one who's been blackmailing me. And when she finds out what he's doing, she's going to try to stop it. She's going to come after both of us. I need you to explain this to me. All of it. Come in at 2 o'clock. Ask for my office directly. I hung up and immediately regretted calling in sick. Now my absence from the office would be noted. Melissa would ask questions. And if Daniel was already in the system as a potential donor, if the transplant team was already evaluating him, how long before she figured it out? I picked up Marcus from school at 3:15, keeping my voice light and steady even though my insides felt like they were vibrating at a frequency that would shatter glass. He climbed into the back seat with his usual exhaustion, the weight of dialysis sessions and low energy making his movements sluggish. How was your day? I asked as I pulled into traffic. Okay, he said, which is what he always said. Can we go to the park? Not today, buddy. We have a doctor's appointment. Another one? He sighed, the sigh of a child who had spent the last year of his life in a parade of medical offices. Dr. Peterson? A different one. But it's a good appointment. I think. I paused, choosing my words carefully. I think there might be some good news coming soon. He didn't respond, just rested his head against the window. I hated that he'd learned not to hope. I hated what this disease had stolen from his capacity for joy. Dr. Moore's office was on the 4th floor. The waiting room was decorated with children's artwork, paintings of sunflowers and rainbows and families holding hands. I sat with Marcus in the corner and tried not to think about how fragile all of those depicted futures were. When the nurse called us back, she led us to an exam room where Dr. Moore was waiting with a tall, dark-haired man in a white coat who introduced himself as Dr. Castellano from the transplant team. Marcus, how are you feeling today? Dr. Moore asked, shaking his hand. He did this with all her patients, treating them as small people worthy of respect rather than problems to be solved. It was one of the reasons I trusted her completely. Okay, Marcus said politely. We're going to do some more tests, Dr. Moore said. Some blood work, some imaging. It's going to take a couple of hours. But I want to tell you why we're doing it first, because I think you deserve to know. She glanced at me, and I nodded. We might have found someone who can give you a new kidney. That means you wouldn't have to do dialysis anymore. You could go back to eating ice cream without using a spoon, and you could stay up late if you wanted to, and you could be a normal 8-year-old again. Marcus's eyes widened. I saw the fragile seed of hope begin to germinate in his expression, and it terrified me because I still wasn't sure this would work. But first, Dr. Castellano said gently, we have to make sure that your body and the donor's body are compatible. That's what these tests are for. They took him for blood work while I sat with Dr. Moore in her office. Tell me everything, she said, closing the door. I did. I told her about Melissa's blackmail, about the threats she'd made, about Daniel's call. I told her about the warning Melissa had issued in the break room. I told her that I expected an explosion within hours or days, and that I didn't know what form it would take. Dr. Moore listened without interrupting, her expression growing darker as I spoke. The hospital has very strict protocols about blackmail and harassment, she said finally. And we have very strict protocols about accessing patient records without authorization. What your coworker has done is not just unethical, it's illegal. I should have reported this immediately when I discovered what she'd done. I know, I said. But I was afraid. Afraid of what? That it would jeopardize your son's transplant? Yes. Ms. Chen, I understand your position, but what Melissa has done is systematic abuse of power and patient privacy. And now she's escalated to threats and blackmail. That makes it a criminal matter, not just a hospital policy matter. Dr. Moore leaned back in her chair. I'm going to speak to our legal and compliance department today. And I'm going to recommend that the hospital file a report with the police. You need to protect yourself and your son. My stomach dropped. But Daniel, if the police get involved, if Melissa finds out that I reported her. She's going to find out anyway, Dr. Moore said flatly. And honestly, that may be better. Right now, she has leverage because she thinks you're desperate and alone. Once she knows that you have institutional support, that the hospital is taking this seriously, her leverage disappears. And Daniel's decision to donate becomes what it actually is, a choice he's making freely, not something she can threaten or control. What if she refuses to cooperate? What if she makes a scene at work? Then that will be documented. Security will be involved. And she'll likely be placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Dr. Moore's voice was firm. Ms. Chen, I know you're frightened. But you're not in this alone anymore. And your son's transplant is not dependent on Melissa's approval. I wanted to believe her. But I'd spent the last year living in a state of helplessness, and it was difficult to imagine a future where I wasn't constantly afraid. At 5 o'clock, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was a single sentence. Daniel just told me what he did. We're done. And you better pray he's really a match, because if this falls through, everyone in this hospital will know exactly what kind of mother you are. I read it 3 times, and each time felt like a punch to the chest. Everything was about to explode. #chunk6. The message from Melissa sat on my screen like a live bomb. I read it again in the parking garage as Marcus dozed in the back seat, his head tilted against the window at an uncomfortable angle. We're done. And you better pray he's really a match, because if this falls through, everyone in this hospital will know exactly what kind of mother you are. The threat was clear. She wasn't just angry, she was calculating. She was already planning her next move, her next leverage point. If Daniel wasn't a match, if the transplant fell through for any reason, she would weaponize my desperation. She would tell the hospital, tell everyone, that I'd been using my son's illness for sympathy and special treatment. The irony was so bitter I could taste it. The woman who had blackmailed me over his condition was now threatening to use that same condition as a weapon if I didn't cooperate with her manufactured timeline. I didn't respond to her message. Instead, I started the car and drove home on autopilot, my mind already 3 steps ahead, trying to anticipate what she would do next. Melissa had access to the hospital email system. She had contacts in the administrative offices. She had a voice that sounded reasonable and sympathetic, which made her dangerous. If she went to HR before Dr. Moore and the legal department had time to move, she could shape the narrative. She could frame herself as a concerned colleague who had stumbled onto evidence of my supposed exploitation. She could claim that she'd been trying to help me privately, and that Daniel's decision to donate was a direct result of my manipulation. The problem was that none of this was simple. Blackmail was a crime, yes, but it required proof. And while I had her messages, the ones explicitly threatening to spread rumors if I didn't cover shifts or lend money, those messages were on my personal phone. They might not constitute the kind of evidence that would hold up in court or even in a thorough HR investigation. Lawyers would get involved. There would be depositions. My personal financial history, my relationship with my son, my entire life would be scrutinized. And Marcus. God, Marcus would be caught in the middle of it, possibly dragged into interviews, possibly asked to remember conversations or overheard arguments that a child shouldn't have to analyze or repeat. I pulled into my driveway at 5:47 p.m. and sat with the engine off, hands still gripping the steering wheel. My phone buzzed again. This time it was an email notification. From Melissa. The subject line read, concerned colleague feedback, confidential. My hands were shaking as I opened it. To Melissa Torres at hospitalsystem.com. CC, HR Department, Director of Medical Administration. Asterisk, I am writing to express serious concerns about the conduct of my colleague, Sarah Chan, in the Medical Records Department. Over the past several months, I have observed behavior that suggests Ms. Chan may be utilizing her son's medical condition to gain special treatment and sympathy from supervisors and colleagues. Asterisk. Asterisk specifically asterisk. Ms. Chan has frequently requested schedule accommodations, citing medical appointments, yet I have observed her leaving early on days with no documented appointments. Ms. Chan has requested advance on payment/loans from colleagues, claiming financial hardship related to her son's condition. Asterisk MS. Chen has made emotional appeals to supervisors that may be designed to influence work assignments and performance evaluations. Asterisk. Asterisk most concerning, I have recently learned that Ms. Chen may have asked a personal acquaintance to pursue organ donation as a result of emotional manipulation rather than genuine medical need. I am worried that if this information becomes public, it could damage the hospital's reputation and the integrity of our transplant program. Asterisk. Asterisk, I am bringing this forward out of concern for the institution and for Ms. Chen's well-being. I believe she would benefit from speaking with our employee assistance program. Asterisk. Respectfully, Melissa Torres. It was brilliant, actually. Horrible and brilliant. She'd reversed every accusation, made herself sound concerned and reasonable, made me sound exploitative and manipulative. And she'd looped in HR without directly accusing me of anything prosecutable. She was creating a paper trail that suggested I was the problem, not her. She was preemptively delegitimizing anything I might say about her blackmail. My phone rang. It was Dr. Moore. Have you seen this email? She asked without preamble. I just got it. I'm at home. Good. Listen to me carefully. Do not respond to it. Do not contact Melissa. Do not send any emails or messages to anyone else about this situation. I'm going to handle it. Dr. Moore, she's already. I know what she's done. And I'm going to tell you something that I probably shouldn't tell you, but you need to know it. She paused. I already contacted our legal department before I left the office. I already told them everything you told me. They were already preparing a response to any retaliation from Ms. Torres. They were expecting something like this. Something loosened in my chest, but not completely. She's documented everything so carefully, I said. She's made it look like I'm the one using my son. And she's done it all while simultaneously accessing his confidential medical records without authorization, which is a federal HIPAA violation. She's done it while blackmailing you, which is a crime. She's done it while threatening to defame you, which is another crime. What she's written in this email is not concern, it's a coordinated attack by someone who's realized her leverage is slipping away and is trying to burn down the credibility of her accuser. But if she's already sent it to HR is already being contacted by our legal team. They're already being informed that Ms. Torres is under investigation for criminal conduct. That email will be preserved as evidence of escalation and retaliation. Everything she's done is being documented. I heard the certainty in Dr. Moore's voice, and I wanted to believe it. But I'd spent too long being afraid. What about Daniel? What if she contacts him? What if she tries to convince him not to donate? That's possible, Dr. Moore said quietly. But Daniel is an adult. He's already made his decision. And unless I'm missing something, he doesn't seem like someone who would change his mind because his manipulative girlfriend tells him to. After we hung up, I sat in the darkness of my car for another 10 minutes. Marcus was asleep inside. Daniel was somewhere in the city, probably dealing with his own crisis. And Melissa was likely at her apartment, writing more emails, making more calls, trying to burn everything down before I could stop her. I realized then that I'd been thinking about this all wrong. The transplant evaluation wasn't the endgame. It was the beginning. Everything was about to get much worse before it got better. And I had no idea how to prepare for what was coming next. #chunk 7. The transplant evaluation started at 7 a.m. on a Tuesday, and I hadn't slept in 36 hours. I'd taken Marcus to my mother's house the night before, telling her only that we had an important medical appointment. She didn't ask questions, she never did, but I could see the hope in her eyes as I left. Hope that this was finally it. Hope that her grandson might get a second chance at a normal childhood. If she'd known what was actually happening, she would have tried to protect me from it. She would have told me to back down, to let the lawyers handle it, to stop putting myself in the line of fire. But she didn't know. Nobody knew except Dr. Moore, the legal team, and Daniel, who had texted me at midnight saying he'd already been contacted by the hospital's transplant coordinator and had scheduled his own preliminary evaluation for the same day as mine. She called me, his text had read. Melissa's boss called me directly. Said there were some concerns about the legitimacy of my donation and that they needed to do a full psych eval to make sure I wasn't being coerced. I told her the truth, that Melissa never even mentioned you to me, that I decided to get tested completely on my own *. I think your coworker is about to have a very bad day. But that was the thing about nuclear options, they destroyed everything in the blast radius, not just the target. The hospital's transplant center occupied the entire east wing of the 7th floor. I'd been there twice before for Marcus's initial consultations, but this time felt different. This time I was walking into a building where my credibility was already being questioned, where Melissa's email was circulating through HR, where people might be looking at me and wondering if I was the kind of mother who would exploit her sick child. Dr. Patel, the transplant surgeon, was a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and a manner that suggested she'd seen every version of human desperation and had made peace with it. She reviewed my file in front of me without commentary, flipping through pages with a professional distance that made me feel simultaneously seen and invisible. You understand that if Mr. Reeves is a suitable match, the transplant surgery itself carries significant risk, she said finally. Even with a living donor, there are complications that can arise. Infection, rejection despite immunosuppressants, organ failure months or even years later. I need to make sure you understand that having a potential donor doesn't mean certain success. I understand, I said. But without this, his kidneys are failing. We've been on the waiting list for 3 years. I know. She set the file down. I also know there have been some questions raised about the circumstances of Mr. Reeves' decision to donate. Before we proceed with any evaluation of compatibility, I need to ask you directly, did you ask him to donate? Did you encourage him? Did you use any form of persuasion or manipulation? The question hung in the air between us like a blade. This was it. This was the moment where Melissa's narrative was going to determine everything. No, I said. I didn't even know he existed until last week. I didn't ask him to get tested. I didn't know he was going to do it. Do you know why he decided to be tested? He told me it was because he didn't have anyone else depending on him, and he could potentially save a life. He said it was simple math. Dr. Patel watched me for a long moment. That's what he told the coordinator, too. Almost exactly those words. She leaned back in her chair. There's a complication, though. A significant one. Mr. Reeves came to me privately after his initial consultation and disclosed that his girlfriend has been engaging in what he described as controlling behavior. He indicated that she disapproves of his decision to donate and has threatened to end their relationship if he goes through with it. He also indicated that she has a history of accessing confidential medical information without authorization. My stomach dropped. He told you that? He told our psychiatrist, who reported it to me. Which means we have documentation of the fact that any decision he makes regarding donation is being made under duress from his romantic partner, not from you. That actually protects you significantly. It also means we're going to be reporting his account to the hospital's compliance office, which means there will be another investigation into how his girlfriend obtained access to protected health information. 2 investigations. One into Melissa's HIPAA violations, one into her threatening behavior toward Daniel. What happens now? I asked. Now we proceed with his testing, assuming he wants to continue. And we proceed very carefully, with extensive documentation every step of the way. Because if this donation is going to move forward, it needs to be absolutely clear that it's his autonomous choice, made without coercion from anyone, including you. The word felt heavy. Including you, as if I might be a threat to his free will, as if my desperation to save my son might somehow taint his generosity. But Dr. Patel's expression softened slightly. For what it's worth, I've reviewed the timeline. I've read the coordinator's notes from his intake interview. I've seen the psych eval results from his first session. Everything points to a man who genuinely wants to do this. And everything also points to a woman who is attempting to leverage his donation for personal or financial gain, which is a federal crime, and which our hospital takes extremely seriously. I left her office an hour later with a stack of forms and a referral for my own psych evaluation. The coordinator had already scheduled everything: blood work, ultrasounds, cardiac stress tests, extensive counseling to make sure I understood the post-transplant demands. In the hallway, I passed Daniel coming out of a different office. He looked exhausted, but he smiled at me, a small, genuine smile that suggested he'd survived his own inquisition. They're going to call her, he said quietly as we walked toward the elevator. The compliance office. They're going to ask her some very specific questions about how she knew about your son's condition and about our relationship. And apparently, accessing patient records without authorization is a termination of potential criminal charges situation. The elevator doors opened. She's going to lose her job, I said. It wasn't a question. Probably. She's also going to realize that her leverage over you is completely gone. The thing she was threatening to expose, that you were manipulating me into donating, that's the opposite of what actually happened. She's the one who was manipulating me. She's the one who knew about your son and didn't tell me. He paused. And now, there's documentation of all of it. The elevator began its descent, and I felt something shift inside me. Fear was still there, tightening my chest, but underneath it was something else. Momentum. The kind that comes when you finally stop running and start fighting back. What happens if the blood tests don't match? I asked. If he's not actually compatible? Then we both just wasted a lot of time, Daniel said. But I don't think that's going to happen. Neither did I. But I was beginning to realize that what happened next might be even more complicated than what came before. #Chunk8. The blood work came back 3 days later. Dr. Patel called me directly, which was unusual enough to send my heart into overdrive before she'd even spoken. The preliminary compatibility markers are excellent, she said without preamble. We're looking at a 94% match. We'd like to move forward with the full tissue typing and cross-match testing immediately. If those come back as favorably as we expect, we could have Mr. Reeves cleared for surgery within 2 weeks. 2 weeks. I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot for 20 minutes after hanging up, unable to move, unable to process what 2 weeks meant. 2 weeks until my son got his second chance. 2 weeks until the transplant that would let him grow up, go to summer camp, maybe even play soccer like he'd always wanted to. 2 weeks until the nightmare that had consumed the last 3 years finally ended. My phone buzzed. A text from my mother. How did it go? I called her instead of texting back. He's a match, Mom. A really good one. They're moving forward. The sound she made, half laugh, half sob, said everything. In the background, I could hear her asking Marcus if he wanted to call me, and then my son was on the phone, his voice small and uncertain the way it had been before he got sick, before all of this. Does this mean I can eat pizza again? He asked. It means we're going to have so many celebrations once you're better, I promised. Pizza every week if you want it. The other thing that happened in those 3 days was the compliance investigation's findings. A letter arrived at my apartment on Thursday, CC'd to the hospital's HR department, the legal team, and marked for your records. It outlined everything: Melissa's unauthorized access to patient files, her documentation of Marcus's condition, the text message chain where she'd explicitly threatened to spread rumors about me, the email she'd sent to leadership containing medical information she had no legitimate reason to know. The hospital was terminating her employment for cause. They were also filing a report with the state licensing board and had referred the matter to law enforcement for potential criminal charges under HIPAA violation statutes. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt tired. What I didn't expect was Melissa herself showing up at my apartment on Friday evening. I didn't open the door. I looked through the peephole and saw her standing there in the hallway, her shoulders hunched, her face blotchy with crying. Part of me wanted to pretend I wasn't home. Part of me wanted to call security. But there was something in her posture that made me crack the door open, keeping the chain lock engaged. I got the letter, she said without preamble. From the hospital. They're pressing charges. Criminal charges, not just termination. You violated federal law, I said flatly. You blackmailed me. You threatened me. What did you think would happen? I was trying to help, she said, and her voice broke on the words. I was trying to help because I saw you struggling and she stopped, swallowed hard. My daughter needed a transplant when she was 5. She waited 4 years. She got an infection and died before a kidney became available. And I watched you with your son, and I couldn't stand watching it happen again. I stood very still. The chain lock felt suddenly thin between us. So I got obsessed, she continued. I started researching, and I found Daniel's information in the system. He'd had a consultation for something unrelated, and I realized he was a match, and I thought if I could just force things to happen faster, if I could make you understand that you had to do whatever it took. You didn't help, I said quietly. You made it worse. You made me question my own integrity. You made me feel like I was being manipulated and exploited by someone I worked with every day. I know. Tears slid down her face. I know that now. Daniel told me, he came to see me before he did the evaluation, and he explained how I'd been manipulating him, how he'd realized he didn't even want to donate because of me, and then he decided he did want to donate because it was his choice, not mine. And I realized I'd done the same thing to you, just in reverse. I'd stolen your agency. I'd made your son's illness about my guilt. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. I'm losing everything, she whispered. My job. Probably my apartment because I can't afford it without the job. Daniel and I are over. I deserve it, I know I do, but I'm terrified, and I don't know what to do. Part of me wanted to feel satisfaction at that. The part of me that had been terrified for weeks, that had lain awake wondering if my coworker was going to destroy my reputation, that part wanted to watch her suffer the way she'd made me suffer. But I thought about her daughter. I thought about 4 years of hope dying in a hospital bed. There's a therapist, I said, opening the door wider despite everything. Dr. Moore. She works with people who've experienced medical trauma. I think you should call her. I think you need to talk to someone about your daughter. Melissa looked at me like I'd slapped her. Why would you help me? Because you're broken, I said, and it was true. And because Marcus is going to get his transplant, and I'm going to be too happy to stay angry at you. And because maybe if you get help, you won't do this to someone else. She left after that, thanking me in a broken voice that made me want to take back everything I'd said. But I meant it. What she'd done was inexcusable. And she was still a person who'd lost a child. The surgery happened on a Tuesday in June. Daniel went into the ER first, and then Marcus, and I sat in the waiting room with my mother and watched the clock and tried not to think about the things Dr. Patel had warned me about. Infection. Rejection. Organ failure. But mostly I tried to hold on to what Daniel had said. It's simple math. 1 kidney from someone who didn't need it. 1 child who desperately did. The equation resolved itself in the operating room while I sat drinking terrible coffee and my mother held my hand. When the surgeon came out 6 hours later and told me that everything had gone perfectly, that both Daniel and Marcus were stable and resting, that the new kidney was already producing urine, that's when I let myself believe that this was actually happening. That my son was going to be okay. The rest, the legal proceedings, the settlements, the complicated feelings about Melissa's fall from grace, all of that would come later. But in that moment, standing in a hospital hallway with my mother's arms around me, I felt the weight of the last 3 years finally lift. My son was going to have a future. And that made everything else worth it.